acid-base physiology, and this is where the organs of the body are really going to interact in order to maintain homeostasis in terms of the pH of our blood. So first, let's talk about the normal plasma pH is between 7.4 or 7.45. Some say as low as 7.35 is within normal range. But below 6.8 or above 7.8, we are incompatible with life. So know that this is really tightly controlled. We can measure this clinically using an ABG or a VBG, which is an arterial blood gas or a venous blood gas. But it has to be accurately corrected because there's a lot of things that can change those values in a short amount of time, which is kind of the benefit and also the harm. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Here's the equation that I want you to focus on. It's called the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. And most of the time we try to avoid equations once we get to this level, but I really need you to understand that all of this is interrelated. So first here we have an acid, which is CO2. We have hydrogen protons, which are highly acidic, and they need to be buffered by certain bases. The main buffer that we're gonna worry about is bicarbonate. Other than that, there's not really a lot of ways to deal with the pH in the blood besides blowing off CO2 in the lungs or removing hydrogen ions from the blood, aka via the kidneys. So know that if you increase one side of this equation, it'll drive it the other way. So the more CO2 that we have, the more bicarbonate we need to make in order to make up for that. If we have high bicarbonate, we're going to have more CO2 in order to balance that equation. Now this is what we want it to look like. CO2 is equally balanced with our bicarbonate. So let's start with acids. Like I said, CO2 is one of our acids that's excreted by the lungs, and this is really good acutely. Now, if I were to increase the amount of CO2 in my body right now, I could blow it off by simply just breathing out. If I change the rate of breathing, then I can change the amount of CO2 that's blown off. The other types of acids are titratable acids and ammonium. And these exist in the body and they need to be removed. And the way that we remove them is by combining hydrogen ions on top of them to say, let's remove the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood to decrease the pH. This is usually done by the kidney, and so it's best for that chronic compensation or anything that's more than a few seconds. Now, the lungs can do it within a few seconds to a few minutes, and the kidneys can correct systemic abnormalities within 30 minutes minimum, up to 24 to 48 hours. The second thing that I want you to look at is these bases and buffers. Now, buffers are going to change strong acids into weaker acids. So bicarbonate is one of the things that we recover and create in the kidney in order to maintain the pH. Buffering acids, just like we talked about previously, you can add on these hydrogen ions to different acids in order to get them out of the body safely. Now, there are a lot of things that can stimulate bicarbonate concentration. There's reabsorption. So when the body's really acidic, then we're going to reabsorb more based on that pH. If we have higher PCO2, which is one type of acid, then we're going to stimulate the reabsorption of bicarbonate. And if there's more sodium reabsorption, then we're going to absorb more bicarbonate. And you'll see why in the lecture that talks about the nephron. As far as bicarbonate excretion, of course, if the blood's more basic and there's less CO2, then there's not a need for the bicarbonate, so we're going to excrete that out. This is a very important chart. This is going to help you understand what we see on labs when we get an arterial blood gas and we are trying to determine where the acidosis or alkalosis is occurring. So first we need to determine what's the pH. Is it acidosis or is it alkalosis? Then we need to look at different disturbances in the blood, and we'll kind of go through how to read one of these in just a moment. But first, let's talk about the different values that we are given that we need to interpret to determine what type of acidosis or alkalosis it is. because it can either be stemming from respiratory or can stem from metabolic or in the blood or what's happening in the kidneys, but the other mechanism is usually going to correct it. So first we're given this pH. Here's your cute little rainbow arterial blood gas box, and we're going to start with pH. Now pH is going to tell us the level of hydrogen ions in the blood, telling us is this acidic or basic. From there we can determine the PCO2. Now the PCO2 determines the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood. This is all measured arterially. We like to get it from either the ulnar or radial artery. We can also get it from the femoral artery and some other places in the blood, but this allows us to have the appropriate amount of CO2 before oxygen and CO2 have exchanged at the capillary beds. That's why the PaO2, or the partial pressure of oxygen, is going to be up here 80 to 100. On a venous blood gas, this is going to be your number one value that changes, because we will have already gone to the capillary beds, diffused across the oxygen, and so it's going to mess up with our PaO2. But bicarbonate, this is only a representation of the bicarbonate concentration in the blood, but it's seen right here, HCO3. Finally, we're going to look at the oxygen saturation. This is the amount of oxygen on a red blood cell. 95 to 100% is where we like it. This is what you will also see with a pulse ox, but this is a lot more accurate because there are just a few things that can interact to make a pulse ox read incorrectly. And finally, some of your systems may give you a base excess, which is only determined if you have other electrolytes available, and we'll cover that in the anion gap section. So for determining those acid-base disorders, you need to first decide whether the values are high or low. And usually I put an arrow up or down on those values based on what's memorized right here to determine if it's high or low. Then I look at those values, starting with a pH. If it's low, they're acidotic. If it's high, then they're alkalotic. Then I want to determine, is it respiratory or primarily metabolic? And the way that you do this is by looking at CO2, because metabolic is going to match. So high pH, high CO2. For respiratory, if there's a high pH, then it's going to have a low CO2. And you can see that right here. For example, in metabolic acidosis, there's a low pH and a low bicarbonate, as well as a low PCO2. For respiratory, you're going to have a low pH with a high PCO2. And then we'll talk about compensation here. So finally, like I just said, with bicarbonate, we want to know is the body responding and attempting to correct for the problem that's occurring. So if we have a metabolic acidosis with a low pH and a low PCO2, that's because we had low bicarbonate and the PCO2 is trying to help correct that. Same thing here. If we have a respiratory acidosis with a low pH, we have a high PCO2 because that's where the acid is coming from. A respiratory acid is PCO2. And then the body says, hey, let's make more bicarbonate in order to correct for that acidosis. And so the bicarbonate increases. So remember, metabolic matches, respiratory is reverse. Another way to think about it is if the pH matches the CO2, then it's primarily respiratory. If it matches the bicarb, then it's primarily metabolic. Now there are several electrolytes in the blood that help maintain a neutral charge. These are potassium, sodium, chlorine or chloride, and bicarbonate, and they show up on your metabolic panel. And this is how you'll see it written if it's written on paper. Or written in paper charts, or sometimes even printed off versions use this as well. And you can see that there are some positively charged and some negatively charged ions. So let's talk about what's called an anion gap. Now, in the blood, we usually measure only a few of the substances that exist that are positively and negatively charged. So sodium is our major positively charged ion. These are cations. We also have a little potassium that contributes up here, but mainly it's sodium. The other one is chloride, and that's an anion. Chloride and bicarbonate are easily measured in the blood, and they make up the majority of the anions. So there's all these other ones that we usually don't measure. So what we do is we kind of just get rid of those, and we say, okay, we know that there are a lot of other anions that exist, so we're just going to leave this imaginary gap here in order to account for all of those things that we don't measure. And we say, okay, this is under normal conditions. Sometimes we include potassium, but sometimes we don't on that cation side. But the problem comes when there are abnormalities in this anion gap. So normally you have high sodium with normal bicarbonate, normal chloride, and this anion gap that says, hey, there's a bunch of negatively charged ions we're not measuring. But if the blood becomes more acidic, then there are two different types of metabolic acidosis. Now, both types were consuming bicarbonate, right? We're trying to decrease the pH of that blood, so we consume this bicarbonate. When we do that, you can either make up for the anions there in chloride with an increased level of chloride, or there might be other anions present that interfere with that, such as drugs, salicylates, things like that. We'll talk about on the next slide. But usually chloride doesn't increase, it stays about the same, even though bicarbonate's decreasing. So something else has to make up for it. So this is a high anion gap metabolic acidosis versus a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Like I said, there's loss of bicarbonate on both, but either there's increase in the unmeasured anions or hyperchloremia. Now, mud piles, this is old school mnemonic for some of the causes, the major causes of a metabolic acidosis with an anion gap. So all of these different substances are negatively charged and present in the blood. So when we see a metabolic acidosis and we say, hey, there's some charges that are not made up for, then we can say maybe we should be looking more at a drug cause, maybe looking at more at diabetic ketoacidosis or kidney failure with uremia, as opposed to some of the other causes of metabolic acidosis. This final slide, it's really good, but it's a little bit in depth and confusing if you don't feel comfortable with it. But it shows you the differences in the CO2 based on alkalosis and acidosis and how they interact with the response of metabolic changes. So based on the bicarbonate level, kind of how those will adjust in order to balance out the pH level.